I take the liberty of requesting a favor of you to engage lodgings for me previous to my arrival. Mr. Lear, who has lived with me 3 years as a private secretary, will accompany or precede me in the stage, and Colonel Humphreys, I presume, will be of my party. On the subject of lodgings, I will frankly declare to you that I mean to go into none but hired ones, if these cannot be had tolerably convenient, for I shall not be nice about them. I would take rooms in the most decent tavern till a house can be provided for the more permanent reception of the President. I have already declined a very polite and pressing invitation from the Governor of New York to lodge at his house till a place could be prepared for me, after which, should any other offer of a similar nature be made, there could be no propriety in my acceptance of it.
It is said that George Washington's first presidential residence impressed simple people with its elegance and impressed elegant people with its simplicity. The brick, 3-story house on the corner of Cherry and Franklin Streets in New York City, which served as the United States Capitol from 1789 to 1790, was alternately known as the Franklin House and the Samuel Osgood House, after the first and second husbands of Maria Brown Osgood, who had offered the house to Congress for use by the President-elect. The house had rented formerly to presidents of Congress, and while in use by President Washington, the home contained the private office of the President, the public business office, and Washington's living quarters. A niece of Walter Franklin, Quakeress Sarah Robinson, described the preparation of the house a day before Washington's arrival in a letter from April of 1789.
Great rejoicing in New York on the arrival of General Washington. Previous to his coming, Uncle Walter's house in Cherry Street was taken for him, and every room furnished in the most elegant manner. Aunt Osgood and Lady Duer had the whole management of it. I went the morning before the General's arrival to look at it. The best of furniture in every room, and the greatest quantity of plate and china I ever saw. The whole of the first and second stories is papered, and the floors covered with the richest kind of Turkey and Wilton carpets. The house did honor to my aunts and Lady Kitty. They spared no pains nor expense on it. Thou must know that Uncle Osgood and Duer were appointed to procure a house and furnish it. Accordingly, they pitched on their wives as being likely to do it better. I have not yet done, my dear. Is thee not almost tired? There is scarcely anything talked about now but General Washington and the palace.
Washington conducted his business as president in the Osgood House until February of 1790, during which time he met with domestic and foreign dignitaries, and he and his wife held state dinners every Thursday. It was in the Osgood House that Washington wrote the first Thanksgiving proclamation, setting aside the last Thursday in November as the national holiday. While the Osgood House has the distinction of being the first seat of the federal government, it soon proved too small to conduct the meetings, gatherings, and accords that President Washington needed to accommodate. In addition, the house was located in one of the most congested parts of Manhattan due to its proximity to the port along the East River. On February 23, 1790, Washington relocated to the Alexander Macomb House on Broadway in Manhattan. Recently vacated by the French minister, Washington purchased the furnishings of the house for his use, and some of the pieces still survive at Mount Vernon today. Washington even had his own stables built at the second presidential mansion, but 5 months later, in July, the Residence Act of 1790 relocated the Capitol and presidential residence to Philadelphia for 10 years, while the permanent Capitol and White House were to be constructed in Washington, D.C. The act was passed just as New York State was completing what would have become Washington's third New York residence. The Government House later served as the State Governor's House, a boarding house, a customs house, and the home of the New York Historical Society. In Philadelphia, Washington occupied the presidential mansion, previously owned by Robert Morris, a senator and personal friend of Washington's. Indeed, Washington lodged at the house while Morris owned it during the 1787 Constitutional Convention. Here, Washington served the rest of his terms as president, save for 2 brief stays at Germantown when a plague of yellow fever swept through Philadelphia. Until 1797, when Washington gave a dinner to President-elect John Adams. The first president of the United States toasted the second, saying,
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last time I shall drink your health as a public man. I do it with all sincerity, wishing you all possible happiness.
Adams served in the presidential mansion in Philadelphia until 1800, when he moved in to oversee completion of the White House. Though the outer walls were not quite finished, the Adams braved the cold winter months as the first family to stay in the White House.
I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof.
President John Adams wrote that statement to his wife on his second day in the newly built White House on November 2nd, 1800. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had the words inscribed on the stone fireplace of the state dining room. They remain there to this day. Designed by Irish architect James Hoban, the White House was built in the neoclassical style of white-painted Aquia Creek sandstone. While Adams was the first president to live in the White House, his stay was a short one. In 1801, Thomas Jefferson moved in and became the first president to stay in the House for his full terms in office. Jefferson called the White House a pleasant country residence, and even though Jefferson thought the house too big, he still sought ways to add upon the structure. The east and west colonnades, originally designed by Jefferson and architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe, were built to conceal domestic operations such as a laundry, stables, and storage, and today still stand as connections to the east and west wings of the White House. Only 13 years later, the White House went from under construction to under siege. As the United States was once again locked in battle with Great Britain during the War of 1812, the new American capital came under fire in 1814 in what became known as the Burning of Washington. The British, in retaliation for the burning of Upper Canada's Parliament buildings in the Battle of York, attacked Washington, D.C., and set the White House on fire. Paul Jennings, a slave owned by then-President James Madison, was just 15 when he witnessed the evacuation and attack on Washington, as he recounted in his later life.
After the war had been going on for a couple of years, the people of Washington began to be alarmed for the safety of the city, as the British held Chesapeake Bay with a powerful fleet and army. Everything seemed to be left to General Armstrong, then Secretary of War, who ridiculed the idea that there was any danger. But in August 1814, the enemy got so near that there could be no doubt of their intentions. Great alarm existed, and some feeble preparations for defense were made. Commodore Barney's flotilla was stripped of men, who were placed in battery at Bladensburg, where they fought splendidly. A large part of his men were tall, strapping Negroes, mixed with white sailors and Marines. Mr. Madison reviewed them just before the fight and asked Commodore Barney if his Negroes would not run on the approach of the British. "No, sir," said Barney. "They don't know how to run. They will die by their guns first." They fought till a large part of them were killed or wounded, and Barney himself wounded and taken prisoner. 1 or 2 of these Negroes are still living here. It has often been stated in print that when Mrs. Madison escaped from the White House, she cut out the frame of the large portrait of Washington, now in one of the parlors there, and carried it off. This is totally false. She had no time for doing it. It would have required a ladder to get it down. All she carried off was the silver in her reticule, as the British were thought to be but a few squares off and were expected every moment. John Soucet, a Frenchman, then doorkeeper and still living, and McGraw, the president's gardener, took it down and sent it off on a wagon with some large silver urns and such other valuables as could be hastily got hold of. When the British did arrive, they ate up the varied dinner, drank the wines, etc., that I had prepared for the president's party.
From 1815 to 1817, the White House was rebuilt. During the American Civil War, the position and overcrowding of the White House led some in Congress to propose a separate residence for the president and use the White House only for business. A new estate was designed at Meridian Hill in Washington, D.C., but the plan was ultimately rejected. When Theodore Roosevelt moved into the White House in 1901, further expansions and renovations took place, such as the establishment of the West Wing for official day-to-day functions of the office of president, and later, President William Howard Taft expanded upon the West Wing with the addition of the Oval Office. Greeting the 27th President of the United States were silk velvet curtains and a checkerboard floor made of mahawa wood from the Philippines. Caribou hide tacked with brass studs covered the chairs in the room. President Taft chose the olive green color scheme. President Roosevelt's office had been rectangular. Taft relocated the office and changed its shape to oval, like the Blue Room in the White House. Preferences for oval rooms date to the time of George Washington. At the president's home in Philadelphia, Washington had 2 rooms modified, with a bowed end in each that were used for hosting formal receptions called levees. As his guests formed a circle around him, Washington would stand in the center to greet them. For President Taft, the Oval Office may have symbolized his view of the modern-day president. Taft intended to be the center of his administration, and by creating the Oval Office in the center of the West Wing, he was more involved with the day-to-day operation of his presidency than were his recent predecessors. The office was further redesigned and expanded by Presidents Hoover and Franklin Roosevelt, the former adding more space to the office, and the latter going so far as to enlist New York architect Eric Gulger to excavate a full basement and adding a basement layer of offices, as well as a penthouse story. Until 1974, the vice president typically resided in his own home, conducting business from his offices in the West Wing and the Eisenhower Executive Office Building next door to the West Wing on the White House premises.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.